Welcome to Data Summit Connect 2021, our virtual conference. So we have an amazing program for you over the next 2 days. But before we get started, I'd like to just go through a couple of housekeeping issues for you. As you get acquainted with our feed loop platform, let me point out a couple of things to you that even if you've been on the platform before, you may not know about yet. You can take a selfie. I think at least 2 people have done that. Go to Launch Photo Booth and you can do that. We have a brand new matchmaking opportunity. So if you've got some questions you want answered, if you want to start a discussion with people, if you're looking for help with something, try that matchmaking area. We do have a networking area. You'll see that over to the left of your screen. And if you click on networking and groups, you will see the places you can go to discuss things with our speakers. There's a place there for our keynote speakers this morning. Each track has its own area in networking where you can go and talk with the speakers, talk with the other attendees at the conference. And of course, you can't miss the exhibit hall because we have a number of exhibitors here just dying to talk to you, and they've got some pretty cool stuff. So you do want to go over to the exhibit hall. I actually really like the way FeedLoop sets up the exhibit hall to make it look as real as possible in a virtual environment. So without taking up any more of Joe's time here, I want to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Dr. Joe Perez. And Joe is a senior systems analyst and team lead for the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. He's had an illustrious career before his current job. He's done all kinds of things, starting out with a 10-year career as a high school teacher. And quite frankly, I think he's still teaching, even though his job doesn't say teacher. You know, that's still really what he is doing, and that is what he is going to do for us. He has other attributes, shall we say. He's, for one thing, I mean, I think this is absolutely fascinating because he sings, he plays the piano, he composes songs, and you know, as we go through this conference, I might even ask him to start writing songs for us. Sorry, Joe, didn't warn you about that in advance. But now
okay.
let me turn the virtual podium over to Joe.
Very good. Thank you so much, Mary D. What a kind and gracious introduction. I don't know about the songs, but we'll see what we can do. All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Let's go ahead and get started. Hope you can see my screen. All right. On May 25th, 1961, President John F. Kennedy, in an address to the U.S. Congress, issued a challenge to the entire country when he said, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." This coming July marks the 52nd anniversary of the day America met that challenge, just 8 years after the president threw down the gauntlet. But you know, this monumental feat could not have been accomplished without using data that was made actionable. Think about it. There were innumerable logistical issues to tackle. Things like timing the launch when the relative positions of Earth and Moon were optimal, choosing a landing site that met all the right conditions, supplying the needs of the astronauts, calculating fuel consumption parameters, figuring out how to get them there, and more importantly, bringing them home safely. Man, the list just goes on and on and on. Remember, the microprocessor wouldn't even be invented until 1971. So the technology needed to conquer all these insurmountable obstacles simply did not exist. Yeah, I mean, it's not like they could Google anything because the internet hadn't been invented yet either. They just had to make it up as they want. All of this that you see on your screen exponentially increased the value of having actionable data during the Apollo program to give NASA the insight needed to answer the incessant questions, make those tough decisions, and ultimately meet JFK's challenge. Well, if you think about it, they actually exceeded it, didn't they? Techipedia defines actionable insight as information that can be acted upon or information that gives enough insight into the future that the actions that should be taken become clear for decision makers. In other words, meaningful data that's useful for making a decision, answering a question, or solving a problem. It distinguishes data that can improve things from data that serves as nothing more than fancy window dressing or interesting trivia. But in data storytelling, with every data visualization, you have to start somewhere, right? You have a concept or an idea in mind. And then you have as your end goal a completed visualization containing one or more graphs. Now, how do you get from concept to reality? Well, I'd like to think of this data storytelling journey as a spectrum, along which I suggest various stages, specifically 5, for best practices in getting from the idea on the left to the completed visualization on the right. These 5 stages are conception, inception, perception, inspection, and direction. Now, the way I've listed these stages across the screen here, you might assume that my intent is for them to occur one after the other, and yeah, maybe so, but they can also be concurrent and even overlapping. In any case, we need to look at these in the light of a strategy that's comprehensive and with a positive mindset. See, this is supposed to be an enjoyable thing to do, not a drudgery. And don't forget, before your concept becomes reality, it needs to be visualized and it must stand up to scrutiny. I'll give you more detail on that in just a few moments. So let's jump right in. First stage, conception. Hey, you have to start the race somewhere, don't you? Now, how do we go about doing that? Well, I see the key word here as being articulate. So as you articulate the need, it's important to understand your audience. Those are the people who are going to be consuming your data. Hey, you've got to know your audience. I mean, look, you wouldn't articulate the need to a room full of project managers in the same way you would to a group of business intelligence specialists or to DBAs and programmers in the same way you would to a bunch of university faculty members or data scientists or anyone else. You also need to know your data. Now, that's a given because you need to be able to articulate what you're going to do with the data, and doing so is where your concept or idea is conceived. Okay, the most important thing to be articulated is the purpose for your data. That is, what are you trying to show? Are you showing comparison, distribution, composition, or relationship? Well, the answer to that will determine the type of visualization that would be the most appropriate for the story you're telling with your data. And that in turn is going to lead to more questions that guide you to refine your approach along the way. Think of it as a hierarchy. Dr. Andrew Abella, chairman of the Department of Business and Economics at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., has come up with an amazing graphics tool that I believe masterfully articulates the need and sets the pace with these 4 categories that he's identified for data storytelling. Okay, let's take a look at Abella's chart chooser cheat sheet. Bit of a tongue twister. All right, you see the 4 categories radiating out from the center, and then the questions coming off of that, and then the sub-questions, and then the right graph types at the very end. All right, we're taking composition as our example here. Let's start asking questions. Does it change over time or is it static over time? And if it changes over time, well, are you talking about many time periods or few time periods? And if there are many periods, well, then are the differences relative or are they relative and absolute? So you see how questions lead to other questions as you proceed along the decision tree here. And that helps you, once again, to refine that approach and come up with the right graph. Well, at least the ones that are considered to be the best practice. That's the stage of conception. Second stage, inception. Once the race has been started, hey, here's where we need to make the case. Keyword, advocate. Make the case for expressing the concept visually. Hey, folks, this is very powerful for a couple of reasons. According to Mike Parkinson, founder of Billion Dollar Graphics, we are affected by graphics in two ways, cognitively and emotionally. First of all, cognitively. Graphics speed up the way we communicate and help us to better understand and more clearly remember what we've learned. They're like visual clues that we can use to unlock a deeper meaning and focus our attention so that it's more likely we'll remember what we've seen. Let's say your proposal for a new data analytics center has been approved for use by your state's technology governance board. And you have helped raise a ton of money to get it going, right? You're concerned by cost overruns though during constructions, but you've gotten so many expense reports, you're literally drowning in numbers, and all you have to get a handle on it, or try to anyway, is a set of spreadsheets, thousands upon thousands of rows and columns to somehow try to make sense of. Man, you're going to give yourself a headache before you're even done with it, right? Okay, by contrast, a well-chosen, properly configured set of graphs will focus your attention so that you can pinpoint the cause that you're looking for much more quickly. Secondly, we're also affected emotionally. Graphics also improve our mindset and affect our feelings. They connect with our creativity by stimulating different parts of the brain, leading us to more fully understand what's being presented. All right, continuing with that analogy here. Suppose you're committed to promoting computer literacy among economically disadvantaged children in your state, and you've been working with the National Science Foundation to set up code camps. But you're having a hard time gauging the effectiveness of your new program. Now, of course, responsible person that you are, you want data to prove it one way or the other. So what do? You ask for more data, and what do you get? More spreadsheets. Man, rows and columns, rows and columns. I'm getting sick of rows and columns. Whew. Well, by contrast, somebody else shows you just the right graph and something catches your eye. You see a dramatic improvement shown by a spike in one of the bar charts or something that caught your eye, and boom, you realize what you've just done. You have instantly made an emotional connection with your data, something that you're really passionate about, and now you have the insight that you need. Hey, a picture's worth 1,000 words, isn't it? See, that's something that no spreadsheet or tabular report could possibly do anywhere nearly as quickly. Now, do you realize what Parkinson's saying here? We are affected both cognitively and emotionally. In other words, graphics get a hold of both our brains and our hearts. Hey, what better marriage could you possibly want? I mean, anytime that you're able to touch both the brain and the heart, man, oh man, you have got something good going. Hey, that's both beauty and brains at work. British data journalist David McCandless said in a 2010 TED Talk that sight, by far, has the highest bandwidth of any of the five senses. About 80% of the information we take in is by eye, he said. Now, additional research in the years since then has shown that to be more like 90%. To that point, it's important to pay attention to visual cues. All right, have you ever seen those paragraphs with scrambled up words that seem to pop up on social media every once in a while? Kind of funny, I mean, why do we seem to be able to read them so easily? Or a lot of us do anyway. Well, here's an example. Let's see just how quickly you can pick this up as I read it, okay? Right? Ready? Let's go. Watch this. According to research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be at the right place. The rest can be a total mess and you can still read it without problems. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. Whew, glad I made it through that. I mean, that should give you a headache, huh? Now, why is it that you could read this? And for that matter, What's true about what I just read to you and what's just plain bunk? Well, to start off with, Cambridge University never conducted such a study. I mean, it sounds kind of like something they might do, right? But nah, there's no record of it. It is true, though. The human brain does indeed process words as a whole rather than one letter at a time. However, you need contextual inference. That is, they should be rather small words and arranged in such a way that we can use our experience so that the brain can fill in those gaps. And we're pretty good at that. We'll see the same principle on a visual level with an optical illusion in just a few minutes. Also, it helps when basic sounds are preserved. For instance, you can more easily guess that TOATL stands for total, TOTAL, than you could if maybe it had been spelled TALOT instead, right? And lastly, it's easier when you can predict what's coming up next. Again, the human brain from previous experience is best at filling in the context from incomplete information when it can anticipate what's coming up next. You know what? They coined a term for this kind of thing. Are you ready? Typoglycemia. I'm serious. You gotta love it. All right, look, this principle also applies with data storytelling. Just as words are perceived as pieces of a message, so also images are perceived as parts of a story. So McCandless really hit the nail on the head with this thing, didn't he? A couple of European research professors, Henry Sawyer and Robin Hogarth, teamed up on a study in which 3 groups of economists were asked the same question regarding a particular data set. Now, the results of this story seem to support McCandless's TED Talk claim. One group was given the data and a standard statistical analysis of the data. Remember, they only had one job to do, just one question. In spite of it, 72% of those economists could not get the answer right. A second group was given the data, the statistical analysis, and a graph. Now, y'all think they did better than the first group? Yeah, good. I see you nodding your heads. No, I'm kidding. I cannot see you nodding your heads. Okay, look, you're right if you said that they did. They did do better, but not by much. Still, 61% of those economists couldn't pull it off. Again, they only had one question to answer. A third group was given only the graph, all right? No data, no analysis, nothing, just the graph. And only 3% of them got the answer right. You know what? This certainly makes the case for visual representation of data. And it's something that we can advocate. That's the stage of inception. So far, you've learned how to start the race and you've made your case. Now, motivate the base. Keyword here is educate. Hey, folks, we're not going to get very far in this data storytelling process if either the target audience or the stakeholders are not on board. So we need to educate them, making them realize that they've got some skin in this game. Hey, they can't take ownership or provide the necessary backing, financially or otherwise, if they don't understand what you're trying to present, or if they can't see what's in it for them, or if the visualizations don't help them to make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem. So how do I go about doing this? By understanding some basic principles. I mean, that's foundational to any educational initiative, right? For instance, you ever hear somebody say, oh, he's all talk and no action, or she's all beauty and no brains, or this project is just form without function. So it begs the question, does form follow function? I'd have to say yes. I mean, it's the age-old argument. Is it pretty or is it right? Does it look good or does it work? Okay. Now, with this business about form following function, I believe it leads to another question. What do we mean by form and function? Well, function is what you do with the data. That's the brains. Whereas form is how to express functional outcomes in the best possible way. That's the beauty. Okay, here's some best practices or cardinal rules that we should keep in mind to ensure that function gets the right priority over form in our data storytelling. Yeah, it ought to look pretty, but it's more important that it be right. Let me show you some examples of what not to do and how to deal with it. First of all, pie charts. Yeah, oh boy, you gotta love them or hate them. I mean, there's typically no middle ground with these guys, right? I mean, some people think they're the best things in sliced bread, while others say they're the spawn of the devil himself. Regardless of how you might feel about pie charts. Suppose your mom baked you a small pie when you were a kid and said you could have it all. Okay, maybe not all of it at one time. So she cuts it into 4 slices. Now, how many of those 4 slices would you end up eating if you were to consume the whole pie? I'd hope that you'd say 4. Very good. Oh boy, so smart. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to insult anybody's intelligence. I'm simply making a point that it should be pretty easy to understand that pie charts are supposed to show the parts of a whole. Everybody ought to know that, you'd think, but some people just don't get it. I'll show you what I mean. Take a look at the pie chart shown in this fuzzy screenshot from a TV newscast. I see a couple of problems with this chart right off the bat. Okay, first of all, look at the numbers. If you add them up, you get 193. I mean, how can you have 193% of a single pie? That's almost like 2 pies. Secondly, let's check out the sizes of each slice. Okay, now 70 is supposed to be bigger than 60, isn't it? Yeah. Well, then how come that 60 slice looks bigger than the 70 slice? In reality, the survey questions used in putting this news report together allowed for multiple choices. That is, respondents were able to indicate support for more than one candidate. Aha, light bulb moment. Now you see why the numbers add up to more than 100. Now, that in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem. But the problem here is that's not the way you show things in a pie chart. We can therefore pretty safely conclude that this pie chart is misleading. And in this particular case, a bar graph would have reflected the data more accurately, don't you think? Yeah. Okay. Something like this. You know, it's the same data, but presented in a way that is not misleading. So what about line graphs and bar charts? Okay, another best practice is that the y-axis should have a consistent scale. Take a look at this bar graph showing how congressional funding for the Department of Defense has changed over time. Upon first glance, you might assume that there was a huge drop between fiscal year 2011 and 2012, followed by another smaller but significant drop the next year. You see that? But look more closely at the odd way in which the vertical axis is scaled, from 450 to $750 billion, thus making the change between those 2 years appear to be fairly drastic. I'd call this chart a little bit misleading. By contrast, look at the chart on the right. It's the same data, but this time, the y-axis is now scaled to start from 0. You can see perhaps a more realistic depiction of the Department of Defense funding trend over that same 14-year period of time. Now, I'd say the second chart is not misleading. Okay, let me explain something. Notice that I didn't call that second chart corrected necessarily. See, many organizations, people, institutions, whatever, they're going to purposefully represent their graphics in a particular way, however it is that they want, without any regards whatsoever to statistical accuracy or norms or anything else. The only thing they're caring, let's make it look good, no matter what the data says. Oh, I want it to say what the boss wants it to say. Okay. In fact, specific misrepresentation of data occurs in many cases for self-serving purposes, manipulating the data to make it say what they want it to say instead of allowing the data to speak for itself. Now, personally, I think we should hold ourselves to a much higher standard of accuracy and integrity. That being said, it doesn't necessarily mean that the y-axis should always be forced to start from 0 in every single case, every single time. Think about it. Sometimes when you're comparing multiple data sets with multiple series in which a whole bunch of numbers are kind of really closely clustered together, I mean, the only way you can see a difference between them graphically is to zoom in on that scale. Sometimes you can't help that. All I'm suggesting is whatever you do, be consistent across the board and avoid making changes over time appear to be more drastic than they really are. So not only should the y-axis be scaled consistently, but it should also be labeled properly. Check out this screenshot from a South American newscast with a graph showing the number of COVID-19 tests performed per million among the populations of the 6 countries depicted here. Now, do you notice anything missing here? You know, if I were asking you at an in-person conference, you'd say, oh yeah, no label in the y-axis. Exactly. Now, although I admit, yeah, there is merit to the minimalist approach, right? You don't want to over label things and get chart junk, okay? But if your vertical axis does not have a label, your chart can be misleading. In this case, it really is. I'll prove it to you. Look closely. You see how the 7,000 per million in the US is 21 times bigger than the 330 per million in Argentina, right? But the bar for the US is only slightly bigger or taller than the one for Argentina. You'll see a similar distortion in the bar for Italy, right in the middle. Okay, 14,000 is twice as much as 7,000, isn't it? But why isn't the bar twice as tall? You know, Italy's bar is only just a little bit taller than the one for the US. Even if it had a vertical axis, this scale is still way distorted. Therefore, I'd call this chart misleading. See, the distorted perception that this graph tries to portray, at least subconsciously, is that the differences aren't all that great among these 6 countries when that is simply not true. I'll talk a little more about distortions with shapes in just a couple minutes. Okay, here's some other best practices that influence perception. If you're plotting something chronologically, it should go from left, the past, to right, the future, along the x-axis. If you're measuring quantity, plot it along the y-axis with the smaller numbers at the bottom and the bigger numbers at the top. Yes, Joe, why are you showing us this? I mean, isn't it pretty obvious? Well, yeah, but I've noticed in recent years a trend that seems to want to reverse this practice, you know, this upside down business with the big numbers at the bottom and the little numbers at the top. I got to admit, it does look pretty cool, but it's still confusing. And then be consistent when you're using colors, remembering that there are universal constants, you know, like red means stop, danger, decline, and green means go, safety, growth. Okay, these days we are encouraged to adopt a more muted palette due to concerns over accessibilities and so forth. But you know, the principle's still the same. Spencer Sobczak tells us that contrasting colors differentiate between groups, whereas different shades of the same color can communicate the relative strength or weakness of a value. And then keep your shaped graphical elements proportional to each other. Master statistician and Yale professor Edward Tufte advocates not exceeding what he calls the lie factor. Essentially, it says that the representation of numbers as physically measured on the surface of the graphic itself should be directly proportional to the quantities they represent. As a mathematical equation, it's often expressed like this: the size of the effect shown in the graphic divided by the size of the effect shown in the data should never be greater than 1. Let me illustrate. In one of their iterative product releases for a new iPad model several years ago, Apple touted its greater battery capacity over its predecessor. Rightfully so, you know, I mean, a 17% increase in battery juice is pretty significant. But look at this graph, though. The battery icon on the right, representing the capacity of the new iPad, looks like it's maybe 3 or 4 times bigger than the one on the left, representing the predecessor. That's certainly way more than 17%. And as much as I like my iPad, that, my friends, is a misleading graph. And finally, always use the right tool for the right job. Hey, you wouldn't use a chainsaw to carve a turkey, would you? How about a sledgehammer to crack a walnut? Of course not. Look, the same principle applies with data visualizations. Remember Abella's chart chooser. Let's take pie charts. I mean, pie charts are great, unless you're one of those that think they're the spawn of the devil, right? Okay, they are great as long as they are used in the way in which they're intended to be used. But two of them side by side, yeah, not so much. In all fairness, the two pie charts you see here are 100% accurate. Okay, there's nothing misleading or deceptive going on here. However, you still have to go back to the make the case, the inception stage, and ask yourself, well, what are you trying to show here? Can you do any of the three things I talked about? Remember the three characteristics of actionable data. Can you make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem with it? Each chart by itself is trying to show how these 5 countries compare among themselves and to what extent they contribute to the whole. The two pie charts together show how that overall makeup changed from one point in time on the left to the next point in time on the right. Now, for the sake of the argument, it really doesn't matter what time frame is being compared in each pie, nor what the parts of the whole represent. Here's the problem. The human eye, together with the human brain, simply does not have the spatial acuity to perceive minute variances across multiple dimensions at the same time. Huh? All right. In simple terms, for those who would use a chainsaw to carve a turkey, it's pretty hard for us to see them differences in these slices when they're side by side like that. Yeah, precisely. So while the pie charts themselves are accurate, they're not actionable because we're not able to do any of those three things I talked about. Remember, again, the 3 characteristics of actionable data. It should help you to make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem. So why can't we do it? Because you can't tell just by looking at it. Did you hear what I just said? Isn't that the whole idea behind data visualization? I mean, the visual part, you can't even spell visualization without spelling visual. If you can't tell just by looking at it, then it's not actionable. If somebody has to explain it to you, it's not actionable. If you can't figure out what's going on, folks, it's just plain flat out not actionable. Got it? All right. Now, as I calm down here, what if we were to express the same data as side-by-side bar graphs? Watch what happens. Boom. You can clearly see the trend they were trying to show, just like that. The order of the countries from 1 to 5 was completely reversed in the second time period. That took you like 2 seconds flat. Pie charts. All right. Remember earlier when we asked the question, does form follow function with a yes? Well, now we ask the question, does conclusion follow assumption? You know what? I'd have to say no, at least not always. I mean, that's because folks don't always see things in the same way. Let's take a closer look. Here's a classic. Tell me, what do you see in this picture? Of course, if we were in the live audience, some of you would shout, oh, I know, it's a young lady. Others would shout, I know, it's an old lady. You know what? I see an old lady here. And I see a young lady here. See, the young lady is facing away from the camera. All right, let me show you. I'll use my mouse as a laser pointer here. Okay, you see her little nose here and her left eyelash. You go over to the right, you see this is her left ear, and see this whole thing here is her chin, here's her jawline. She's wearing a little black necklace, okay? She's facing away from the camera. I also see an old lady. The old lady is facing towards the camera. Look again. This time, this again here is her right eyelash. This thing is her left eye. This whole thing here is her nose. There's her nostril. She's got a wart or a bump on her nose or something. Here's her mouth, her pointy chin jutting off to the left. Okay, right? Some of you said young lady, some of you said old lady. Who's right? Well, you're both right. See, it's all a matter of perception. Let me ask you this. How would you describe an elephant to somebody who's never seen one? Can you imagine walking into a room blindfolded and trying to tell what it is that you're feeling here? You're going to come out of there saying, it's a spear, it's a fan, it's a wall, it's a rope, it's a tree, it's a snake, right? Hey, look, different people perceive things in different ways. And for effective data storytelling, we must capitalize on that because a picture is worth 1,000 words. Quick review up to this point. You've started the race, you've made your case, and you've motivated the base. Now, number 4, give it some space by asking the question, does it stand up to scrutiny? This is inspection with a key word being investigate. Hey, folks, being totally transparent helps you to avoid the pitfalls of bias and unethical use of your data when it's being inspected. And when you've done your due diligence, you're not going to cringe when you get these 3 questions. You know the ones I'm talking about, your favorite ones. Did you ensure data quality? Where did you get your data? How do you know it's right? You won't be bothered by them. They won't intimidate you. Now, here's a trend that seems a little counterintuitive. The more complex your data model is, the less likely your people will be to embrace it. To that point, suppose you wanted to buy a blender for your grandmother, and the only 2 choices you had were the ones on this screen. Which one do you think would be the better choice? Beauty or brains? Enough said. Now, regarding transparency, in a 2017 blog post, Matt Rainey, founder and director at a European talent search firm specializing in big data, advocated the importance of transparency in data and suggested 3 aspects of transparency. First of all, it starts with a story. What better way to make sense of an unintelligible mass of numbers than to put them into a story? Again, that's the whole point of a data visualization, right? We learn best by seeing things in stories. And like I said earlier in the presentation, understanding their data helps people to take ownership, and by extension, it facilitates their ability to explain or justify it to whoever needs to know. Secondly, it involves showing the data for what it is. Warts, blemishes, wrinkles, and all. No manipulations. See, correct, honest decisions and correct conclusions can only come from correct, unadulterated, unmanipulated data. And lastly, Rainey says that transparency is all about trust. I mean, hey, aren't you more inclined to believe what you can trust, right? I love the way Rainey put it. Look at this. When the business learns to trust the numbers, they have a solid foundation for making the best decisions and subsequent growth. Now, having taken transparency into consideration, as you let the data behind your visualization project stand up to inspection, it's important to be aware of the difference between impact and influence and how that plays into making data actionable. Hold on. I thought impact and influence were the same thing. Well, no, I see a difference between them. Okay, impact is typically recognized as an effect brought on by outside forces that tend to push on your status quo. In a recent Harvard Business Review study, it was found that almost 85% of a company's performance depends upon outside factors. What's funny about it is that many of those same companies don't even have a clue about figuring out which of those outside forces are affecting their performance and how. Instead, those who make it a priority to identify those factors are pushed into acting upon them. That's impact. By contrast, influence is generally known to be the power to affect from internal forces that tend to pull on your status quo. See the difference? Impact is external, tends to push. Influence is internal and tends to pull. Hey, these are factors that your own organization can control. I'm talking about things like the way your data is organized and structured, when and how you're going to pull it into your data warehouse, and the general climate in your organizational culture. See, Doing this is going to pull your strategy in the right direction from the inside. To put it bluntly, as I alluded to near the beginning of this presentation, your idea must be visualized, then scrutinized before it can be realized. In other words, if you've given it some space and it can stand up to inspection, you are well on your way to making your concept a reality with the beauty and brains of actionable data. That said, I believe that we in the data technology space can measure success in this area by capitalizing on this knowledge and turning ideas into reality by blending impact with influence, leveraging them both into a solid game plan to meet short-term needs and provide long-term benefits. Why is that? Well, look at the chart as I build it on the right side of your screen, because by this time you will have learned to take your data, differentiate it to come up with information, see the connections to derive knowledge, determine the meaningful connections to grant insight, find the best paths between them for wisdom, and boom, at that point, you have impact, and you will most certainly generate influence. Well, after having started the race, making the case, motivating the base, and giving it some space, we now come to the fifth and final stage of the spectrum, direction. It's time to put it into place. Keyword here is effectuate. Hey, folks, you're the catalyst, okay? You're the one who's gone through the stages. You're the one who has asked the right questions, done your due diligence, scrubbed your data, chosen the right visualizations, ensured validity and integrity. So what's your implementation plan? How do you put it all into place? What's the direction here? I see this implementation cycle as a fourfold iterative process. You start off by deploying your solution using whatever organizational protocols and methodologies you already have in place. And as your stakeholders start using the solution, they'll discover issues. Believe you me, they will discover issues, okay? They may call them issues, they may call them defects, they may call them problems, but mark my words, they will discover issues. You then analyze those issues and discern the right course of action to address them. Then you start developing the remediation for those issues. And guess what? The cycle starts all over again. Deploy, discover, discern, and develop. Hopefully, you'll improve upon your solution with each iterative cycle. Now that, my friends, is an effective direction because it leads to progress. In conclusion, you ask, can I really turn my ideas into reality? You bet your boots you can. While developing your solution and moving it along these 5 stages of the spectrum, try to ensure best practices with beauty and brains are followed. American mathematician John Tukey once said, "The greatest value of a picture is when it forces us to notice what we never expected to see." Hey, what value do you see in your data? And what ideas do you have when you see it? To stimulate these ideas, remember, graphs and data visualizations are only as good as the data they portray. They should never be any more complex than the data they portray, and they should never paint a distorted picture of the values they portray. And don't forget Tufte's lie factor here. And never let the size of the effect shown in the graphic be greater than the size of the effect shown in the data. One last review and summary. Here are the 5 stages of the spectrum one last time. The first stage, conception, start the race. Second stage, inception, make the case. Third stage, perception, motivate the base. Fourth stage, inspection, give it some space. Fifth stage, direction, put it into place. Enterprise account executive and expert data storyteller Spencer Sobczak once said, "Data storytelling is both an art and a science. Our data visualizations are the most powerful when they find this balance." You now have the tools. So let's go balance art and science. Let's combine form and function. Let's blend both beauty and brains. Hey, folks, I'm totally convinced that if you articulate, advocate, educate, and investigate your data, you should be able to effectuate a solution. Ladies and gentlemen, with actionable data, NASA exceeded President Kennedy's monumental challenge more than half a century ago, and not only sent astronauts to the moon successfully, but also returned them to the Earth safely. And what's more, they repeated it 5 more times over the next 3 years. Hey, they definitely knew how to balance art and science, beauty and brains. But remember, they couldn't have done it without actionable data. So what is actionable data again? Data is actionable only when it helps people to do what 3 things: make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem. Hey, what can you do with actionable data? You may not be putting a man on the moon, but as an information technology professional, you can certainly put the heat on your competition. If you have enough vision and drive, you can figure out how to get from today to tomorrow before it becomes yesterday and you're left behind holding the bag. Remember, with both beauty and brains, do this: turn your ideas into reality by making data actionable. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Joe.
Yes, ma'am.
I definitely see the high school teacher coming out in you every once in a while. Um,
You're very kind.
we do have a comment in chat where one of our attendees said she especially liked the charts from data to impact. I was going to add something about color because it was brought home to me at one point where we were looking at a dashboard that was in development, and they were using colors, and they were so excited about the colors and all this. And one of the developers said, "Hey, wait a minute, I'm colorblind, and your
Right.
colors are not working for me. I cannot see the difference between some of the colors that you have used." So that's just a comment. I did have another question, which is your 5 stages. Has any of your thinking changed with this as we've moved into this era of big data with the the volume, the velocity, particularly the volume? Has that changed your thinking on any of the ways that you would implement your 5 stages?
Sure. Yeah, especially with the volume, perception becomes even more important. With more and more data, uh, it's easier. In a way, it becomes easier. In a way, it becomes harder. It becomes easier in that the more and more points you have, the smoother of a curve or a trend line that you'll be able to extrapolate. The longer period of time you're looking at, the more runway that you have to make your predictive, um, you know, uh, your predictions into what the future may hold based on how long of a line that you're looking at. So all those work in your favor, but with all that volume also comes a greater possibility of extraneous data, greater possibility of bad data. It's a little more difficult to spot the red herrings. Now, when you have such a large variety of the data and such a great volume, then perhaps the red herrings won't matter as much because they'll be overcome by the sheer volume of the other data. But the greater the disparate data sources that you do introduce into it, especially in big data, when you do have so many more sources, then again, you have a greater possibility of introducing these red herrings that are going to distort things and give you more reason to ensure that you have spent more time in the cleaning phase. And I don't even talk about that, in these stages. This is assuming that you have done the cleaning and the preparation ahead of time. So that's the other thing that I would, as far as shifting my own paradigm with
Yeah.
regards to this, in that, yeah, a whole lot more time will need to be spent in scrubbing and cleaning the data, especially considering all the various disparate sources from which it will come.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Joe. That was great. And stick around, because we're going to hear from our second keynote speaker, and then we will move into questions for both of you. So now let me introduce our second keynote speaker of the morning, Chuck Frisbie, who works with Sisense's strategic OEM and enterprise accounts, designing embedded and infused analytics architectures. So we are going now to hear from Chuck. So I'll throw it over to Chuck.
Good morning. My name is Chuck Frisbie with Sisense, and today I want to discuss breaking the adoption barrier with infused insights. This is the dashboard paradox. Let's talk about the term data-driven. We're in a room full of data and analytics experts, so we're probably not talking about this. Although some might argue that a self-driving car is driving with data. The term data-driven gets tossed around a lot as a buzzword. And you see it from time to time on LinkedIn posts or a presentation by a vendor that if you use my services or my technology, that you can aspire to become data-driven. But what does the term mean to you? Are you data-driven? How does an organization become data-driven? Does it mean a team of analysts writing SQL and generating reports? Where do those reports go? A PowerPoint in a board meeting or a spreadsheet for the finance team? If someone is making decisions based on that data, then they're data-driven, right? Or should you be working with data scientists to become data-driven? Surely if your AI and ML models can predict your optimum price points and margins, then you must have a data-driven organization and you must be squeezing the most ROI that you can out of your data. But we know that's not the full story. Most organizations have at least a dashboard or two. For a long time, BI and analytics tools have suggested that self-service dashboards are finally the key to becoming data-driven. That if you build that perfect dashboard that meets all your requirements, allowing business users to explore data themselves might finally make an organization data-driven. Or are we missing something? The world of data has evolved over the years, and with it, the people, the skills, the technology, the laws, and just about everything we can think of. We've seen the birth and explosion of cloud infrastructure and its effects on almost every person and organization, but most of all, on the world of data and those of us in this room. To keep up, we've adapted our tools and developed new strategies. We've created query tools to make sense of our transactional databases. We've seen the rise of ETL reporting and dashboards. We use Hadoop and other distributed systems to break apart and manage big data. And now we're implementing MDM, graph, and virtualization technologies to bring it all back together. We live in a world where security is paramount, yet half of you still have that one guy in IT who can help you bend the rules. The future of data is exciting and will be full of surprises. We are certain of a few things. Every industry recognizes the value of their information assets and the potential of big data and analytics. This graphic shows the relative impact of analytics across industries and business functions, but you can see that there are many areas we aren't even scratching the surface. We continue to see more dollars invested in data infrastructure, analytics solutions, and other data applications. In fact, according to Gartner, by 2022, 90% of corporate strategies will explicitly mention information as a critical enterprise asset and analytics as an essential competency. The better tools and technologies that we have at our fingertips today afford us the ability to do some pretty amazing things with data. Which brings me back to my original question. Are we data-driven? The short answer is no. Through 2022, only 20% of analytic insights will deliver business outcomes, according to Gartner. And a survey done by PwC found that just 4% of businesses comprise the information elite, businesses with the culture, skills, and resources to unlock information's value. So what's going wrong? The technology isn't to blame. In fact, we have more tools and strategies available to us today than we know what to do with. There are literally thousands of vendors that you can choose from to be a part of your analytics and data stacks. Still, so many reports end up being shoved into a file cabinet. Brilliant AI and ML workflows remain limited in application, and the majority of dashboards sit on the shelf collecting dust until the upstream data changes and they're finally decommissioned. The final step in most analyses today is some form of presentation, be it a report, a visualization, a spreadsheet, or most often a dashboard. The typical data project is treated as a few linear steps: data prep, dashboard, and done. As long as I've delivered on my requirements, I've checked my ETL or ML workflows, and all my numbers pass UAT, I've done my job. Maybe through a few cycles of iteration, collecting feedback and adjusting the presentation, the project will have moderate success for a time at least. This process assumes that if the correct insights and analytics live in a dashboard somewhere, then they will be used. If you build it, they will come, right? Most often, though, as we've seen, we fail to produce business outcomes. This linear process only focuses on half the equation, the analysis. The other half, which gets ignored, is a very important component of that equation. That is the human component. You see, most organizations are not made primarily of analysts and data scientists. Many people are not even analytical in nature. So for some, no dashboard, chart, or report on its own is going to resonate, let alone help them drive business outcomes. The typical dashboard or data presentation fails on another level as well. It assumes that it's answering a user's questions exactly when they need answers. Sometimes they do, but only if a user knows exactly which dashboard to look at and exactly how to interact with it to get the desired answer. Most organizations have hundreds or thousands of dashboards that require multiple filtering steps to finally get an answer. This can be overwhelming, even for somebody who's used to working with dashboards. Forget about the rest of the organization. There's one more important point of failure with this process, and that's what happens beyond the dashboard. Remember our user again, the human component. Why are they looking for answers in the first place? Simple, they have a job to do. They either need a piece of information or a better understanding of their surroundings to make informed decisions. With just a few changes in this fundamental approach, we can restore hope to our forgotten dashboards. But first, let's have a closer look at the title of our presentation, the Dashboard Adoption Paradox. I'll read it in just a second, but it goes hand in hand with all the failure points I just outlined. The dashboard adoption paradox is a mindset in which an organization believes that a data-driven culture can be achieved solely through the perfection of its dashboards and analytics. In short, it is a failure to acknowledge the human component of an analytical workflow. Let's fix that. If we want to escape this situation and to achieve adoption of our analytics strategies, if we want to become data-driven, then we must make the following compromises. First, what's intuitive to you is not intuitive to everyone. Others might need alternate outlets or more intuitive ways to ask business questions than a lone dashboard. We must deliver the right insights to the right people at the right time. That might mean guiding them to the appropriate dashboard or delivering them just the information they need. Context will be key here. And finally, we must follow through with the analysis, considering what happens beyond the dashboard, what a person wants to do with the answers we've given them, and ultimately make their lives easier. So today, most users who need data insights have to develop a question, leave their current workflow, open up a dashboard or report, filter and find their answers, and finally go back to what they were doing so they can take action. Streamlining this workflow is the key to becoming data-driven as an organization, and the only way to do that is to consider how a user should interact with the analysis before anything else. This strategy will need to evolve beyond simple integrations or embedding. We will need to develop ways to truly infuse insights and actions throughout these workflows in order to unlock the value of data. We see data infusion as the ability to take any workflow for any person in an organization and augment it with data to make it faster, smarter, and easier. Data is generated in virtually every application that an organization has access to. This data is often much more valuable in aggregate than it is alone, so every application might become a data source. Conversely, business applications typically serve one purpose, but the end user cares about data across applications. We will need to fuse these workflows together, giving greater visibility and context to our users no matter the task at hand. We need to augment our end user experiences, whether they're working in a messaging app, email, a slide deck, business application, or a dashboard. Wherever you are, you should be able to take action within the context of your data, and you need to do so in as few clicks as possible. At the center of this infusion strategy is, of course, what matters most. I've seen a lot of projects in my years at Sisense. They all have different people, use cases, data sources, and typically a long list of requirements. The thing is, though, that these are often viewed as separate features of an analytics platform. As we think more about augmenting our users' workflows, it becomes obvious that these separate silos need to come together under a unified strategy. We need to fuse these seamlessly into our users' workflows, giving them access to take advantage of these technologies within the context of their daily lives. We will also need to infuse these components together to develop more sophisticated solutions as our users' questions and our organization's data get more complex and interconnected. So what does infusion look like in the real world? Let's have a look at something you're all very familiar with, Google Maps. It's not the first thing that comes to mind when you think of analytics, but it's got all the same building blocks. It gives users access to relevant data of different types, whether they're looking for directions, photos, or reviews. In other words, it provides answers to its users' questions. Google Maps is accessible when and where users need it, and it's extremely intuitive. It also allows users to take action on the answers that they were just provided. You can use it to make a reservation, a phone call, or add a favorite location and share it with your friends. Effective infused analytics is following this same path. Purpose-built apps for seamless experiences that focus on their users. We envision a world where developers can deploy modular data apps anywhere with plug-and-play templates that can give context to a user's workflows and allow triggering of following actions. We will see insights popping up in places we never before thought possible. Sometimes we will let the data make decisions for us, but a true infusion strategy will always have a human focus. And the best part, it's already happening. In the past, these types of analytic workflows were reserved for big budget OEM or embedded analytics applications. Today, more and more companies are realizing that an infused approach is ideal for most use cases, and the technology is getting us closer by the minute. In the next few years, we will see huge shifts in the way we generate, store, and process data, and I'm sure our fair share of other surprises. But we will finally see the ability to create data-driven organizations on a massive scale. As important as the technology is, these types of cultural shifts will share an equal impact on the future of data and analytics. We know how to find the path to becoming data-driven. If this is where you're heading, I hope you're ready to start thinking about infusion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Chuck. So we do have some questions here. Let's start with this one from the audience, which actually is, there's two questions that are very, very close here. So can you give an example of a relevant analytical workflow? And how do you measure if action was taken and the impact of that action? So the other question is basically, how do you see machine learning be infused into an analytics workflow? So those questions are almost the same. So could you respond there?
Yeah, thanks, Mary D. Yeah, so first of all, a relevant action, or relevant workflow. So again, as we kind of talked about, it starts with the question. How do we make it easier to ask those questions? Some of the ways that we see doing that is actually embedding capabilities to ask questions where you're working right now. So imagine you're working in Slack, a question pops up either in natural conversation with another one of your colleagues or in something that you're doing, and you're very used to working with Slack. So maybe that's a Slack bot that you can go in and ask a question. And it's not the kind of gimmicky approach that we've done in the past. Obviously, a lot of people have tried the Slackbot type of workflow, but it's infusing those other capabilities into that. So how do I, one, ask a question, but two, get into the relevant dashboard or dashboards or receive an appropriate visualization? So once I have those capabilities, how do we follow on with additional actions that I might want to take? Do I want to share an insight with a colleague? Do I want to trigger something in another application? And how do I put that right into that workflow? So in Slack, I see a visualization and I'm using context cues from the data or from where I'm asking it to control what actions actually are available to me. And then, of course, there are lots of different avenues that a user can take. Do I go to a dashboard? Do I immediately take action? Do I schedule a meeting? All of those things are possible workflows. The second part of that question, how do you measure action? So, or how do I measure whether or not, you know, that follow-up action was effective? So one, I would say, do we give the users the ability, do we support them in actually doing the thing that they wanted to do? Do we support their workflow there? Did they achieve did they learn what they wanted to learn? Were they able to take the follow-up that they intended? And the second part of that is, very oftentimes we as designers know contextually what's important. So maybe we're going to suggest other things to them that they might not have even thought of, right? So my example I gave a second ago, schedule a meeting. Maybe I wasn't thinking necessarily of scheduling a meeting. I'm going to write that down on a sticky note, schedule a meeting later on. But if I have a suggested meeting pop up to me with some appropriate data assets, that's definitely a successful action or follow-up taken on. And that kind of leads right into your third question, Mary D, which is how does machine learning come into the play? So of course, I would kind of split this out into two different areas. Of course, there's consuming ML workflows, which would be, I have a model, I have it being trained regularly with some of my data, and I want to actually output that or consume it as part of a dashboard. That would be kind of the extent of what we are doing today. But as we think more and more about infusing workflows and making these workflows more intelligent and more actionable, certainly I think ML and AI will take a much larger role in how we enrich those workflows. So using AI and ML to actually drive what actions are available to you, using AI and ML to determine, okay, based on this user, based on their context, or maybe based on a metric from my data, that's going to drive what content is actually served up to us. And this goes not only for analytics, it goes for anytime we're presenting an app or a visualization or anything to an end user. I think those are all going to be affected as AI and ML make their way into any aspect of an organization's IT strategy.
Yeah. Joe, do you have any comments on the role of AI and ML in determining what information is actually actionable?
Actually actionable?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Came out wrong.
Well, right. Yeah. No, that came out right, actually. Yeah, I agree with what Chuck said. You mentioned earlier in his presentation, the failure to acknowledge the human component.
Yeah.
Right. So many people think that they've got it stuck in their head after having watched the Terminator movies that, I'll be back. Right. and we are not going to terminate you. It's where we let the computer do what it does best. We as humans do what we do best. Okay, right? We are the ones who are able to make those decisions in those gray areas where we're able to use our intuition, our years of experience, the way we can tell with certain inflections that a machine at this point certainly doesn't have the capability. What we don't have the capability is to do, the mundane is just plowing through the raw numbers at lightning speed, which we cannot do.
No, we can't.
There's nothing wrong with allowing the machine to do that and, enhance our, not take away from us, but rather enhance our ability. You have to make decisions. You go with your gut. Well, what is it that informs your gut? Data. What do you need to have better intuition into the decision you're going to make? Is more of this data. And so, the advent of these new technologies simply enhance our abilities to use the resources that are at our disposal a whole lot more efficiently. So rather than look upon it as a threat, look upon it as an opportunity. As long as we're the ones that are controlling the model, we're the ones that are controlling the behavior, we're the ones that are teaching, the way to do, and not the other way around where, the computer is the one who somehow evolves into sentience and is able to, make the decisions. Yeah, I mean, right. It's not that way at all, and it shouldn't be looked upon it. We're in control, and we, it's just the same thing with any tool, right? I mean, a chainsaw can do a lot of damage and you're left without an arm. A chainsaw can also get rid of some limbs and things, and not the ones on your body, on the trees that are blocking your, right? And so it's all in the tool. How do you use that tool, right? How do you appropriate it? How do you leverage what you have to your advantage rather than looking upon everything as a threat? I mean, that's my take on it anyway.
Yeah, okay. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Well, we're almost out of time here. So if you have questions for either of our keynote speakers, we will be heading over to the networking area. So click that networking button on the side of your screen, and you can continue the questions and answers and discussions over there. Also, the exhibit hall is open, so I urge you to go to the exhibit hall and check things out over there. We will start up again with 4 tracks. You can choose which session you want to attend by clicking on sessions, and that will give you the running list of what the topics are and who the speakers are. So we look forward to spending the next 2 days with all of you, and we will see you either in the exhibit hall or over in the networking area. So let me thank once again Joe Perez, Senior Systems Analyst and Team Lead for the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, and Chuck Frisbie, Field CTO for SciSense. So thanks to both of you, and we'll see you either in networking or the exhibits.